News just broke this week that President Biden is preparing to enter the 2024 presidential race as soon as maybe next week. Your politics are clearly the left of his, but you've worked with him on a range of issues. Where has he exceeded your expectations, and where has he disappointed you?
Very much exceeded my expectations in terms of investment in public infrastructure, in what with the American Rescue Plan, in really pushing, and I believe that if we were able to do believe that he would have signed those as well. I think when it comes to issues around immigration and criminal legal system, we have a long ways to go.
What political advice? He has to build coalition. He also has to appeal to a huge population that you very much appeal to. So what advice would you give to him?
I think that we are in a really important moment where the community that have historically been almost the center of the political universe, suburbs and very, certain affluent communities, while are still very important part of the political constellation that is this country, young, engaging way that has become a very real political force. It is a political force that the Republican
Party underestimated.
That is underestimated, but not underestimated by the Republican Party. They're already discussing how to engage in disenfranchisement towards young people in addition. And so my advice would be that while this balancing act is difficult, it is not something to be taken for granted. And when we fight for the priorities of young people and in a multi-class, multi-racial coalition.
Row, Republican state legislatures have moved to roll back abortion access actually with 15 states so far passing near total bans. Now access to the drug mifepristone has also been challenged. It seems pretty clear that the fight for abortion access did not end with our still at it very much. How bad do you think this could get for reproductive rights in the United States?
I think we're in an extremely serious moment. I believe that the Republican Party is not starting at Roe. They will not stop at Roe. I believe that what we are seeing is a concerted rollback of civil liberties in general. Our right to privacy, our right to bodily autonomy, our right to marry who we wish to marry. All of this is at risk. I do not think they will stop. And many of the folks, Roe was truly at risk, called progressives hysterical. And they said that we were overestimating the risk, that this is never going to happen. And just as we warned about Roe, we are warning about the very real risks, and we're already seeing LGBT Americans. We have even seen Republican members of the Senate insinuate that interracial marriage is something that should be up for debate. These are our civil rights and our civil liberties, and we have to resist to roll back the basic human rights of certain communities of Americans based on identity.
This week, Fox News settled their defamation lawsuit with Dominion Votes for $787.5 million. A lot of money. It's now one of the largest media defamation settlements in history. Dominion's made a mistake in not requiring Fox acknowledge on air that it lied to its viewers.
Well, this was a corporation suing another corporation for material damages. Their job is to go in and get the money. They're not lawyers for the American public. And I think what is best for the country, what would have been best for the country, would have been to demand that, not settle until we got that. But that is not their role really raises much larger questions. Very often, I believe that we leave to the courts to solve issues that politics is really supposed to solve, that legislating is supposed to solve. We have very real issues with all that with January 6th. Mm-hmm. And we saw that in the lead up to January 6th, and how we navigate questions not just of freedom of speech, but also accountability for incitement of violence. This is the line that we have to really explore.
Organizations or media platforms should be accountable for the role, for being platforms for incitement.
I believe that when it comes to broadcast television, Fox News, these are subject to federal law, federal regulation. Look at what Tucker Carlson and some of these other folks on Fox do. It is very, very clearly incitement of violence. Very clearly incitement of violence. And that is the line that I think we have to be willing.
Your friend and mine has really been working overtime to make the argument that New York City is unsafe. This is your home, where you represent. My mother grew up here. On Monday, Jordan had the Judiciary Committee hold a field hearing in Manhattan in order to attack Manhattan District Attorney Alvin, arguing that this season focus on indicting Trump has led to more crime. What's your response to Jordan and this argument?
Well, first and foremost, it is a complete abuse of power for Jim Jordan to lead a congressional municipal decision. And the reason he is abusing his power is because he has decided that his main job is to defend one individual, which is President Trump, and not to represent his constituents or his district. Every federal government's responsibility to go in and micromanage individual prosecutors on a municipal level. That being said, his claims around safety, while every city has their challenges, what we are seeing in the cities that Jim Jordan represents in New York City does, and if we are actually concerned about crime, what we need to do is get guns off of streets. And because Jim Jordan and the Republican Party does not want to address the crisis that is gun violence in America, and on the people actually do want to hold people accountable.
In the midterms, House Republicans primarily, they ran on the economy, inflation, but since they gained the majority, their focus has been primarily on investigations, stoking culture wars. Like this week, they passed a transgender spat. But also, how would you describe their vision?
Well, the reason Republicans are so focused on these culture wars and they're so fixated on trans Americans and LGBT Americans, and they're fixated on do not have a plan to improve the lives of working people across the country. They just don't. We haven't heard a single hearing or an idea that would fundamentally make people's material lives plan our economy. And in order to distract from their lack of preparation and their lack of vision, they are trying to attack some of the most vulnerable Americans in this country.
Now, Speaker McCarthy, in order to become Speaker, do you think he's actually running his caucus, or do you think someone else is?
He's not. I don't.
Who's running it?
I think you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene running the caucus. I mean, it's very common public statements to that effect. Every time something hates, that McCarthy is doing her bidding. And I think that this is something that is quite clear. I think that Speaker McCarthy is stuck between having to use elements of his party with having to maintain a majority. And he is choosing to side with the extremists.
Do you worry he'll have the votes to pass his debt limit proposal?
I don't. And I think that that's actually the political situation that we're in right now. Greek without a paddle.
So we're here at SUNY Maritime in the Bronx, a beautiful place, by the way.
It's gorgeous.
Where they are breaking ground on an offshore wind workforce development program, something you secured funding for. Mm-hmm. You have an enormous platform. Of course, you have, since you were elected, political capital on.
Well, you know, I think up until now, up until very recently, it's been very difficult to generate political momentum around addressing climate change, especially on the scale that we need to be addressing it on. And critically important, we're very lucky to have very strong political coalitions. But I know that when I was running, this was something that was just beginning to emerge, that same kind of political force and saliency around addressing the climate crisis. And so now, priority, not just for me, but I think for many policymakers, because we also have to handle this in a way that actually addresses the injustices that working class people and communities of color have faced in the climate crisis as well.
You just reintroduced the Green New Deal. When you talk about big, how do you convince those people who believe climate change is real, it is a crisis, but they're concerned that some of these proposed solutions are too grand or expensive? Yes,
well, you know, I think it is important to acknowledge that the scale and the scope of what we are proposing, but the scope of the climate crisis is even bigger. And if we are not proactive about very aggressively and transitionally addressing our infrastructure, our workforce, not addressing it, are going to be far greater.
You're a very effective communicator. You've talked about how the climate crisis impacts communities of color and communities that people talk about a lot. Sometimes people think of the climate crisis as like something that lattes. What's the most effective method in terms of the impact on the next generation that you've found?
The climate crisis represents a challenge, a storm that will hit us, but we will not all be in the same boat. And working class communities that do not have the infrastructure, that have been historically redlined to be deprived of already existing infrastructure, are going to be hit hard as well.
There are a lot of myths and misinformation about the Green New Deal there. You may like even more than I do disputing disinformation. And Donald Trump has said that there in the Green New Deal, you're, quote, not allowed to own cows anymore.
You know, I wish Donald Trump had read legislation when he was president. Clearly, he hasn't read this in culture, and then proactive investments for small farmers across the country.
So cows are allowed, just to be clear.
Cows are totally allowed.
Cows are
ranchers and are going to be a very important partner in addressing this.
Green New Deal, Ocasio's unwilling to work, a lot in a headline.
Yeah.
But what do you say to that?
Well, I represent LaGuardia Airport, and we stand with especially our flight attendants unions and our airline workers a lot. And really, it truly is the climate crisis itself that threatens airports. It is posing a very large threat to our airline industry and infrastructure. So this is actually the opposite. We have to make that we're making the investments necessary so that we're helping folks.
During Texas, said, quote, Green New Deal would be a deadly deal, and blamed frozen windmills and renewable energy for the blackouts.
Well, we know that Governor Abbott was covering for a lot of the oil and gas industry. The Republican governor refused to make the proper investments in the grid in Texas. And so he was really covering up his own failure to properly invest in oil and gas infrastructure by blaming it on a congresswoman from New York, Texas.
It's time when you first introduced the Green New Deal and now the Inflation Reduction Act passed, something you worked very hard on as well. It contained the most ambitious pieces of climate legislation to date, $169 billion in climate and energy investments. So for people who care, you just passed one. People understand is in the Green New Deal that wasn't addressed in the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, I think two things are possible at once. The Inflation Reduction Act was an enormous victory, represents the largest climate action that the U.S. government. It is not in and of itself sufficient for us to address this crisis. This is something that we are going to have to be tackling for our entire lives. This was a good down payment, but there were very real political challenges that we report around major investment around public housing, public transit, environmental justice for those disproportionately impacted communities. And by and large, really the investments that are going to be necessary to transition us to more investment beyond very important, promising down payment in the
more
IRA.
Public housing, more to do work to help address environmental justice issues. Work to be done.
Absolutely. And union protections to make sure that the folks that are